On one side of the room, a government with laws so sharp they could slice a life in half with a signature. On the other, a young man with nothing but words, no army, no money, no state, who would still make that government flinch. If you think the most dangerous weapon is a gun, you haven't met Robert Sobukwe yet. And if you think his story is just another activist biography, stay, because the first twist is that his greatest power wasn't shouting, it was precision. He was born on December 5, 1924, in Graaff-Reinet, a small town in the Cape, where the streets looked quiet enough to trick you into believing South Africa's future would be calm. But calm was an illusion. The country was already arranging itself like a machine. Some people were meant to move smoothly through life. Others were meant to be ground down. Sobukwe grew up watching that machine work, subtly at first, then unmistakably. The rules weren't always written in big letters on walls. Sometimes they were carried in glances, in who had to step off a sidewalk, in which doors opened easily, and which ones made you feel like a trespasser before you even knocked. In the Sobukwe household, discipline wasn't a performance. It was survival. Robert learned early that a mind could be a shelter, something nobody could legally confiscate. He read with an intensity that made books look less like entertainment and more like equipment, tools to dismantle the world and rebuild it in your head. While other boys chased small thrills, he chased clarity. He wanted the clean line beneath the chaos. Why is power obeyed? Who benefits? What does law really mean when it's designed to cage you? And there was another thing about him, something people noticed even before he spoke in public. He didn't beg for approval. He listened, weighed, decided. When he disagreed, he didn't explode. He cut through, not with cruelty, but with a calm that was almost unsettling. Some people carry anger like fuel. Sobukwe carried conviction like a compass. By the time he reached his late teens, South Africa was hardening. Politics wasn't a topic anymore. It was the weather. You didn't follow it. You lived inside it. The ideology that would soon be formalized as apartheid was becoming more than prejudice. It was becoming architecture. And while many young people felt the pressure, not all of them developed a language strong enough to push back. Sobukwe did. He didn't just feel injustice. He tried to name its mechanism. He went to the University of Fort Hare, the legendary institution that produced a generation of black intellectuals and leaders. Fort Hare wasn't merely a campus, it was a forge. Ideas there didn't float, they collided. Students argued late into the night with the kind of urgency people reserve for fire alarms, because the stakes were real. Their arguments weren't abstract philosophy. Those debates would decide how to resist a state designed to outlast them. At Fort Hare, Sobukwe didn't simply absorb knowledge, he organized it. He stood out not as a loud radical, but as something rarer, a thinker with a pulse. He could connect moral principle to strategy. He could read history, not like a museum guide, but like a battlefield map. He studied, wrote, spoke, and the more he sharpened his mind, the more he understood a brutal truth. Polite appeals to conscience would not dissolve a system built on profit and fear. Here is the first quiet twist of his story. Sobukwe was not driven by hatred of individuals. He was driven by an insistence on human dignity so uncompromising it became threatening. He didn't want revenge dressed up as justice. He wanted a country that could not legally produce lesser human beings. And that meant confronting the system at its roots, not trimming its branches. Student politics at Fort Hare were intense, and Sobukwe rose quickly. His presence in meetings had a gravity to it. When he spoke, people stopped fidgeting. Not because he demanded it, because they felt, instinctively, that he was taking the moment seriously, and that made it hard for anyone else to treat it lightly. He became involved in the African National Congress Youth League orbit, where the air was thick with debates about African nationalism, mass action, and the meaning of liberation. But even then, another tension was forming, one that would later explode into open rivalry. In the broader movement, different currents competed, those who believed in broad multiracial alliances and those who feared that such alliances could dilute the core demand, African self-determination, in a land where Africans were being treated like strangers. Sobukwe listened to those arguments like a man listening to the gears of a clock. He wasn't just asking what sounded morally beautiful. He was asking what would actually break the machine. After Fort Hare, Sobukwe became a teacher. On paper, it was a respectable path. Educate, uplift, build the future classroom by classroom. But the country did not allow teaching to be neutral. A classroom under oppression is never just a classroom. It's either a place where the system reproduces itself or a place where the system begins to crack. Sobukwe's style as an educator matched his style as a leader, clear, disciplined, demanding. He treated young minds as serious instruments, not as vessels to be filled. He pushed students to think in structures, not slogans. What is freedom if your mind is still colonized? What is a right if you have no power to defend it? He taught language, but he also taught the terrifying skill behind language, naming reality accurately. The government, of course, preferred its native education to produce obedience, not analysis. A person who can analyze becomes difficult to govern. A person who can name injustice becomes even harder to silence. Sobukwe's very presence, calm, articulate, respected, was a warning sign, because a movement doesn't start with a march. It starts with sentences, with the kind of sentences that people repeat to each other when they're deciding whether fear still controls them. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, the political temperature rose. Apartheid was officially installed in 1948, and suddenly the cruelty had a clean, bureaucratic face. This wasn't chaos, it was administration. The humiliation could now be stamped, filed, enforced. Pass laws tightened like a noose. Communities were classified, separated, watched. People were told where they could live, whom they could love, where they could walk. The state did not just police bodies, it tried to police identity. Sobukwe moved deeper into political life, and his voice gained reach. He wrote and spoke with an intensity that didn't rely on theatrics. He had a talent many leaders never develop. He could make people feel the logic of oppression, not just its pain. He could explain why a system that claims order is often a system afraid of justice. And now, the rivalry that had been simmering begins to take shape, not as petty personal conflict, but as a contest over the soul of resistance. Inside the liberation movement, strategies collided. Some leaders argued for broader coalitions, uniting across racial lines to defeat apartheid. Others, including Sobukwe and those who thought like him, believed that the primary initiative had to remain firmly in African hands, not as exclusion for its own sake, but as a necessary correction in a country where Africans were systematically denied agency. This disagreement wasn't theoretical. It determined who would lead, whose language would define the struggle, and what kind of country would be built after victory. Sobukwe wasn't attacking allies. He was challenging a direction, and that challenge threatened powerful figures who were already shaping national platforms, international relationships, internal hierarchies. In politics, even in liberation politics, influence is currency. And Sobukwe, young, formidable, unbending, was a rising competitor. But he didn't compete with gossip. He competed with ideas. He could stand in a room where everyone expected a fiery speech and instead deliver something colder, sharper, a moral argument with the architecture of a legal brief. He argued that Africans had to be the principal drivers of their liberation, not as a slogan, but as a principle of power. Because if liberation is negotiated while the oppressed remain dependent, you risk swapping one form of control for another. By the mid-1950s, South Africa's resistance politics were becoming more organized and more dangerous. The state was watching. Meetings were infiltrated. Leaders were monitored. The space for legal opposition was shrinking, and every serious activist had to confront a question that feels like a trap. How do you build a mass movement when the state can criminalize the act of gathering? Sobukwe's answer was not to retreat into secrecy alone. He believed in the public dimension of resistance, the power of ordinary people acting together, openly, to expose the illegitimacy of unjust laws. But he also knew that if you call people into the street, you are not calling them into a metaphor. You are calling them into batons, prisons, bullets. So his seriousness deepened. Every choice had weight. And then, another twist. The more he grew in influence, the more he became difficult to place in the boxes both supporters and opponents loved. He wasn't easily flattered into obedience. He wasn't easily provoked into reckless gestures. He could cooperate, but not at the price of principle. He could debate, but not to entertain. In a political culture where charisma often substitutes for strategy, Sobukwe's restraint became a kind of charisma itself. He also understood something that many activists learn too late. Time is not neutral. The state uses time as a weapon. It delays reform. It drags negotiations. It exhausts communities. It makes hope wait until hope collapses. Sobukwe began to speak with the urgency of someone who sees the clock on the wall and knows it's ticking in the government's favor, unless you force it to tick in yours. By the end of this period, the outlines of his future were visible like a storm line on the horizon. A disciplined intellectual from Graaff-Reinet had become a national political force in the making. He had tasted the inner debates of the liberation movement and discovered that the fight was not only against apartheid, but also against the temptation to compromise the center of the struggle. He had become, inevitably, a competitor to other leaders' visions, and whether people admired him or feared him, they could sense it. This was not a man being carried by history. This was a man preparing to grab history by the throat. The most dangerous part was still ahead, because soon Sobukwe would face a brutal, specific time limit. Not a metaphorical deadline, but a countdown that would force him to choose. Speak when it is safe and be ignored, or speak when it is dangerous and become impossible to erase. But to understand why that moment would shake the country, you have to follow him into the next stage, where ideas stop being arguments and start becoming actions the government can't tolerate. Here's the cruelty of leadership under a dictatorship. The moment your ideas become powerful enough to move crowds, the clock on your freedom starts ticking down. The state has all the guns, all the prisons, all the paper to write laws with. You have time, measured not in years, but in how many days you can stay free once you stop talking and start acting. Robert Sobukwe knew that the second he chose action, he was starting a countdown on his own life as a free man. And he chose action anyway. He moved to Johannesburg, into a city that felt like the inside of a machine. Metal, smoke, and the constant grinding of people's lives into profit. By day, he became a lecturer in African languages at the University of the Witwatersrand, a black intellectual in a white institution that was never designed for him. He walked corridors lined with portraits of men who had mapped Africa, divided it, exploited it. Now here he was, teaching the languages of the very people those men had tried to reduce to labor. In lecture halls, he was precise, controlled, even gentle. He taught grammar and poetry, but beneath it, there was always a second curriculum. The idea that African thought, African history, African identity were not footnotes to European civilization. They were central. His students saw it. They saw a man who could have quietly built a career, adjusted, survived. Instead, they watched him slowly sharpen his public voice until it became something the government could not ignore. Yet the resistance landscape was already crowded. The African National Congress had history, recognition, international sympathy. It had leaders whose names were beginning to travel beyond South Africa's borders. Men like Nelson Mandela, already operating in the courts and townships, building networks, organizing campaigns. To many observers, the script felt set. The ANC would lead, others would follow. But scripts don't survive contact with people like Sobukwe. Inside the ANC and its youth league circles, he had once been a respected figure. He knew the organization from the inside. He understood its strengths and its weaknesses. Over time, one disagreement kept returning like a headache. The question of who should lead the struggle and on what terms. Should the resistance rely on multiracial alliances, working with sympathetic white liberals and other groups, or should it center the political initiative firmly in African hands, refusing any arrangement that might dilute the core demand of African control over African land? For many in the ANC, cooperation across racial lines felt both morally right and strategically necessary. For Sobukwe, the danger was different. If Africans did not lead their own liberation, they risked freedom that arrived pre-negotiated, already compromised, controlled indirectly by those who had never known what it meant to carry a passbook, to be evicted overnight, to stand in a queue marked non-white. The rivalry was not about ego, it was about vision. But the personal element was impossible to ignore. Side by side, two archetypes were forming. One, a charismatic lawyer prepared to negotiate, petition, cooperate where needed. The other, a razor-edged schoolteacher turned lecturer who believed that liberation required a deeper rupture, a recentering of African agency that could not be softened for anyone's comfort. People could feel the difference in their speeches, in their tone, in their strategies. By the late 1950s, the pressure inside the ANC had become too much. Younger, more militant Africanists were impatient. They felt the organization was drifting. Too many meetings, too many resolutions, not enough sharp, decisive action. Sobukwe became a quiet focal point for that frustration. He was not the loudest in the room, but he was the one people turned to when the argument reached the edge. What do we do if the main organization refuses to move? The twist came at a conference in 1959 that felt to many like an earthquake in slow motion. Out of ideological fracture, a new organization emerged, the Pan-Africanist Congress. The PASI was not a spin-off hobby. It was a declaration of independence from the dominant strategy of the day. In a hall thick with cigarette smoke and whispered speculation, delegates chose a leader for this new formation. They chose Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. It was a brutal kind of promotion. One day, you're the sharp internal critic. The next, you're the face of a rival movement that will be watched by the state and judged by history. He was elected president, not because he promised miracles, but because he offered something rarer: coherence. He did not talk in circles. He spoke in straight lines that cut through the fog. In his speeches as PAC president, he laid out a vision that was both radical and disarmingly humane. He rejected racial hatred as a guiding force. There is only one race, he would insist, the human race, but the human race, he argued, lived inside systems, and in South Africa, that system had arranged itself so that Africans were permanently on their knees. The point was not to reverse the hierarchy and create new masters. The point was to end the legal possibility of masters altogether. From the first days of his leadership, rivalry with the ANC shifted from private murmurs to public reality. Two movements now competed for the same people, the same townships, the same limited space for legal activity. In church halls and dusty community centers, activists argued late into the night which banner would lead the march to freedom. Under which strategy should ordinary people risk their jobs, their safety, their lives? The government, watching from its fortified offices, might have been tempted to enjoy the spectacle of divided opposition. But even in their rivalry, the ANC and PAC were dangerous. They were training a population to think politically, to question, to organize. And in that field of competition, Sobukwe was something the state particularly feared, a disciplined radical with an unshakable belief in nonviolent mass action. He was about to prove just how dangerous that combination could be. By 1959, pass laws had become the sharpest daily weapon of apartheid. Black South Africans were required to carry passbooks at all times, documents that dictated where they could live, where they could work, whether they had permission to exist in certain spaces. Police could demand pass in the street at any moment. If your papers weren't in order, or if you simply didn't have them, you could be arrested, fined, sent to a distant area, separated from your family with the casual cruelty of bureaucracy. The passes were not just regulations. They were handcuffs made of paper. Sobukwe understood that if you wanted to attack the system at its core, you had to strike at the mechanisms that controlled movement, labor, and dignity. The pass laws were the perfect target. Visible, hated, unavoidable. But to confront them directly meant one thing: confrontation with the full force of the state. So he made a choice that would define his life. The PAC would organize a nationwide nonviolent campaign of pass defiance. Men would leave their passbooks at home, walk to police stations in their hundreds and thousands, and hand themselves over for arrest. The jails, the courts, the entire machinery of repression would be overloaded, exposed, forced to reveal its true nature in broad daylight. There was just one problem: time. The government had been tightening controls, refining laws, preparing new regulations. Once certain measures were fully in place, opposition would become even more suffocated. International attention was still limited. The world did not yet feel the full shock of apartheid. Sobukwe knew that the window for a dramatic principled display of mass defiance was closing. If they did nothing, apartheid would settle into the bones of the country like a disease that people learned to live with. He set the date, March 21st, 1960. From that moment, the countdown began. He had only weeks to prepare a campaign that would involve tens of thousands of people, coordinated across towns and townships, all committed to nonviolence in the face of a state trained to answer disobedience with batons and bullets. Every speech, every leaflet, every quiet meeting in a back room became part of that countdown. While he worked, the rivalry sharpened. The ANC was also considering anti-pass action. It had its own plans, its own timelines. Suddenly, resistance politics looked like a chessboard, where both sides of the liberation movement had pieces in motion. People would ask, who is leading? Whose call will we answer? In that competition, dates mattered. Momentum mattered. History would not remember who drafted the best resolution. It would remember who moved first, who shook the country. In late-night strategy sessions, Sobukwe returned to the same principle: discipline. The campaign had to be clean, controlled, morally unmistakable. No weapons, no riots. No easy excuse for the government to label it a terrorist uprising and unleash unrestrained violence. The power of the protest would lie in the contrast. Unarmed citizens calmly walking into police stations to demand arrest for refusing to carry papers that marked them as inferior. He was not naive. He knew the state would respond harshly, but he also knew that a system based on daily humiliation fears one thing above all: public, collective dignity. The closer March 21st came, the more tense the air grew. In townships, rumors spread like electricity. Men quietly checked their passbooks, then put them away. Women prepared for the possibility that their husbands, brothers, sons might not come home that night, or for many nights. Community leaders debated whether it was too risky, whether people would be crushed, whether the pack was moving too fast. And in the background, the competitor movement watched. Some in the ANC were furious, accusing the pack of trying to steal the show, to jump ahead with a dramatic campaign before broader alliances were fully mobilized. Others simply saw the writing on the wall. Whatever happened on March 21st, Sobukwe would either emerge as a reckless fool or as a leader who could turn moral conviction into nationwide action. The morning of March 21st, 1960, arrived without fanfare. No fireworks, no sirens, just dawn breaking over townships full of men who had decided to walk into danger with their hands empty. In Sharpeville, a township in the Vale, pack organizers moved early. Crowds began to gather, a mixture of determination and nervous energy. People wore their best clothes, as if dressing for a verdict. Some were young and almost excited, whispering about showing the police. Others carried the heavy knowledge of past beatings, past arrests, past disappointments. Police presence swelled. More uniforms, more guns, more tension. In Johannesburg, Sobukwe dressed with the same precision he brought to his arguments. He left his pass at home. That simple act turned everything that followed into open defiance. He walked from his home in Soweto with a group of supporters heading toward the Orlando police station. There was no hiding, no disguise. He wanted the state to see him, to know who had called this day into being. Along the way, some people joined, others watched from doorways. He moved with calm, almost unnervingly so. The clock he had started was now loud enough to feel in the air. When he reached the police station, he did not shout slogans. He spoke clearly, formally, to the officers in charge. He told them that he and his companions had come to present themselves for arrest for refusing to carry passes. It was a request and a challenge wrapped into one. Arrest us for asking to be treated as human beings. Fill your jails with men who refuse to carry proof of their own subordination. Meanwhile, in Sharpeville, the day turned darker. Police confronted the crowd, initially demanding that people disperse. The crowd did not move. Tension rose like temperature in a sealed room. Armored vehicles arrived. Officers were nervous, outnumbered, armed. Some protesters edged forward. Others stayed still, hands raised to show they had no weapons. Children watched. Women watched. The line between demonstration and disaster grew thinner with every passing minute. Then it happened. Shots cracked the air. Not warning shots, not careful, controlled fire, but a spray of bullets into a crowd of unarmed people. Panic erupted. People ran, fell, screamed. Bodies hit the ground, not in some dramatic slow motion, but in the chaotic, ugly tangle that real violence produces. By the time the guns fell silent, 69 people lay dead. Many were shot in the back as they tried to flee. One moment, they were citizens refusing to carry passes. The next, they were corpses lying in dusty streets, their blood soaking into South African soil. News moved faster than official statements. Rumors, then confirmations, rippled through townships and cities. The police had opened fire. People were dead. It was a massacre. The name Sharpeville burned itself into the national vocabulary in a single day. In Johannesburg, Sobukwe was already in custody when the full scale of the killing became clear. He had offered himself up, exactly as he'd promised. When he heard about Sharpeville, from fragments, from shocked whispers inside the controlled world of detention, he understood at once the double-edged nature of what had happened. On one side, the state had revealed its brutality with shocking clarity. On the other, the campaign he had carefully designed as non-violent defiance had been turned by the government's own hand into a slaughter. The rivalry with his competitor movement twisted again. Some would later argue that the Passie's campaign had been reckless, that it had provoked a response the people were not fully prepared to withstand, that a broader, more cautious strategy might have avoided such carnage. Others would insist that the real choice had always belonged to the state. Armed men had chosen to fire on unarmed civilians. Blame the trigger, not the call to stand unarmed. One thing was certain. Sharpeville changed everything. The government responded with fear, disguised as strength. It declared a state of emergency, banned the PASI and the ANC, and set out to decapitate the leadership of both movements. Sobukwe, already in their hands, became more than a political prisoner. He became a symbol the state could not afford to let walk free. In court, he was charged with incitement. The proceedings were dressed in legal language, but everyone knew what was really on trial. The idea that black South Africans could organize themselves independently and refuse to obey unjust laws. The prosecutors painted him as dangerous, fanatical, reckless. He refused to play their game. He spoke with the same calm precision he used in lecture halls, not begging for mercy, but asserting principle. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. 3 years. On paper, it sounded finite, almost mild compared to the scale of the threat he represented. Supporters clung to that number like a promise. 3 years, they told themselves. 3 years, and he'll be back. 3 years, and he'll walk free. Perhaps quieter, perhaps more cautious, but alive, in one piece, ready to think again, to speak again. But the state was already drafting a different timeline. As the gates closed behind him and the walls of prison rose, Sobukwe had to confront a grim reality. His campaign had shaken the country, exposed the system, and cost lives. His rival movement, the ANC, would adapt in its own way, some of its leaders turning toward armed struggle, others working underground, others in exile. The competition between strategies would continue without him in the open field. Inside his cell, the clock he'd started was still ticking, but now it counted down to something he could not yet see. The moment when his sentence would end on paper, and the government would decide whether the law was strong enough to contain him or whether it needed a new, darker invention just for him. For now, all he had was time, and a choice to let prison shrink him or to turn confinement into another battlefield, where the weapon would be the one thing no warder could confiscate at the gate. His mind, how dangerous do you have to be for a government to change the law, not to execute you, but to keep you alive, locked away, and unheard? Not a general law for troublemakers, not a policy for subversives, but a special legal weapon crafted for a single man. In apartheid South Africa, that man was Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, and the cruel irony is this: his greatest crime was not planting bombs or plotting assassinations. It was insisting, with terrifying clarity, that Africans should lead their own liberation, and proving he could make people move. Prison did not begin with iron bars. It began with separation. Once sentenced, Sobukwe was peeled away from the roar of rallies, the density of township streets, the arguments that had filled his days. The noise of politics was replaced by the clang of gates, the shuffle of warders' boots, the hollow echo of his own footsteps down concrete corridors. The state hoped that distance would do what bullets had failed to do at Sharpeville: silence the impact of his ideas. Inside, he worked with what he had left: time and thought. He read law, history, philosophy. He replayed, in his mind, every step that had led to March 21st. The meetings, the pamphlets, the promises of non-violence, the trust people had placed in him, and always, like a splinter under the skin, the knowledge of what had happened in Sharpeville. Bodies in the dust, families torn apart. A country forced to see, in one burst of gunfire, what apartheid really meant. He refused to let prison shrink him into just another inmate. Warders learned quickly that this was not a man they could bully into brokenness. When they addressed him as boy, the casual insult white authority reserved for black men of any age, he answered with a quiet refusal. that unsettled them more than shouting would have. He insisted on being treated as a human being, even in a system designed to strip that status away. Outside, the rivalry he had helped sharpen did not pause for his absence. The African National Congress, under crushing pressure, began to pivot. After both the PAC and ANC were banned, after emergency regulations swept up leaders and organizers, after peaceful protest had been answered with mass shootings, more and more voices inside the ANC argued that nonviolent protest alone was no longer enough. A new armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, was born. Sabotage campaigns began. The struggle's script twisted, from petitions and marches to bombs planted under cover of night. And there, behind bars, was the man who had refused to carry a weapon, whose genius lay in mobilizing unarmed crowds with nothing but conviction and courage. His competitor movement was moving into the age of armed struggle. His own organization, the PAC, was decapitated, scattered, its structures smashed, its members hunted. On the chessboard of liberation, the ANC still had visible pieces. The Parsi's king was locked in a box. The clock on Sobukwe's sentence ticked down. 3 years. That was the number written on the paper. Around him, other prisoners measured time in the same way, scratching lines into walls, counting the months until the day a gate would open and they would step back into the world. Supporters on the outside clung to that date. Even some in government reassured themselves with it. Let him sit. Let him cool down. Then he'll be released into a country where the security laws are tighter, the networks are fractured, the fear runs deeper. But the closer his release date crept, the more restless the state became. Behind polished doors in Pretoria, officials studied reports on him. This was not just any political prisoner. This was the man whose name people whispered when they talked about defiance. The man whose speeches students had copied by hand. The man whose refusal to compromise had already attracted respect far beyond the membership of his own organization. What would happen, they asked each other, if he walked out? Would he return to the lecture hall, accept a quieter life, maybe even leave the country if given the chance? Or would he pick up exactly where he had left off, reorganize, reconnect, and start another campaign that might ignite the townships again? The answer scared them enough to commit a legal obscenity. As his sentence approached its end, Parliament introduced a clause in the General Law Amendment Act that sounded oddly bland. It allowed the Minister of Justice to order the continued detention of certain prisoners for up to 12 months, renewable year after year, without charge or trial. It did not mention him by name in the text, but everyone knew what it was. They called it casually, almost jokingly, the Sobukwe Clause. Imagine hearing that. Imagine being in a cell, counting down to freedom, and then learning that your country's lawmakers have debated, drafted, and passed an entirely new legal instrument. Not to deal with the broad problem of unrest, not to manage a wave of violence, but to keep you, personally, from stepping outside. On paper, he had served his time. In reality, his time was being rewritten. In May 1963, instead of walking into freedom, he was transported to a place that would become synonymous with political imprisonment, Robben Island. But even there, he was set apart. The state understood the danger of his voice so clearly that it did something unusual even by apartheid standards. It isolated him, not just from normal society, but from other political prisoners. While men from the ANC, the PAS, and other banned organizations broke rocks together in the quarry, trading ideas and fragments of news, building networks through shared hardship, Sobukwe was kept alone in a small house near the main prison. The isolation was surgical. He could see the sea, hear the wind hammer the island, watch warders come and go, but he could not mingle with the other prisoners, who, in another universe, would have debated strategy with him for hours. For 6 years, the Sobukwe Clause was renewed annually like a dark ritual. Each year, a minister's signature turned 12 more months of his life into a legal ghost. No fresh trial, no evidence presented, no verdict to appeal. Just paperwork that extended his silence. Each renewal was a reminder. They did not fear what he had done. They feared what he might still do. Yet even here, cut off physically, he found ways to work. He studied law with ferocious discipline, requesting textbooks, working through case after case. To warders who saw him sitting at a table, spectacles on, pages spread out, he might have looked like a man preparing to pass exams. But it was more than that. Law, in his hands, became both a shield and a map, a way to understand the machinery that had been turned against him, and a way to imagine a future in which that machinery would be dismantled. He exercised, paced, kept his body as strong as his surroundings allowed. Some warders, exposed to him day after day, found their stereotypes crumbling. This wasn't the caricature of the radical agitator painted in government briefings. This was a calm, disciplined man who talked about justice with unnerving clarity, who refused to hate even those enforcing his captivity. He didn't scream at them. He challenged them, quietly, logically, relentlessly. Outside those thick walls and rolling waves, the rivalry that had once played out in crowded halls now shifted to the world stage. The ANC, despite its own leaders being jailed, banned, or exiled, managed to project a coherent, recognizable face to the outside world. The name Nelson Mandela began to travel, attached to stories of underground struggle, sabotage trials, and life sentences. Photos of him, fist raised, became symbols. The ANC's strategy of building international alliances, engaging with foreign governments, and speaking diplomatically about multi-racial democracy resonated strongly in capitals far from South Africa. The PAC, crippled by its leadership void and facing even harsher repression, struggled to maintain the same profile. It still had organizers, guerrillas, exiles, but its president lived as a rumor more than a presence. On Robben Island, men held in the main prison would sometimes glimpse him at a distance, a solitary figure walking in a small yard, flanked by guards. To them, he was both near and unreachable, like a star you can see clearly but can never touch. The twist of history was brutal. Strategically, he had once tried to outpace the ANC, to prove that a sharper, Africanist line could inspire the masses more powerfully than cautious alliances. Now the ANC, though battered, was the recognizable flagship of resistance. He was the man for whom an entire law existed, and yet whose name many outside the country never learned. But isolation did not erase his influence. It sharpened it. Stories about him leaked through cracks. Warders who talked after transfer, visitors who carried impressions back to the mainland, fellow prisoners who caught that distant glimpse and turned it into legend. Young activists growing up in the late 1960s, searching for heroes who had refused to bend, found his speeches, his early writings, the record of the March 21 campaign. Among them were students who would build the Black consciousness movement, people like Steve Biko, who looked at Sobukwe and saw a blueprint, uncompromising about African dignity, yet refusing to become a mirror image of racist hate. Sobukwe, without giving a single public speech, was still working inside people's minds. Time, however, was not working for him. Robben Island was harsh to the body. The damp, the cold, the constant stress of surveillance, the limited medical care. They left marks. His health began to fracture. A persistent cough refused to fade. Pain became a regular visitor. When doctors finally admitted the seriousness of his condition, they gave it a name heavy with dread: tuberculosis, a disease that flourished in conditions just like these, cramped, enclosed, wearing. Here, The countdown took on a new intimate scale. It was no longer just about political time, laws, bans, campaigns. It was about lungs, cells, the invisible spread of damage inside his body. The state now faced a grotesque calculation. How long could they keep this man imprisoned, isolated, without allowing him to die in their custody in a way that might transform him from a silenced radical into a martyr? Their solution was another twist. Change the walls, not the terms. In 1969, after 6 years under the Sobukwe clause on Robben Island, 6 years beyond his original sentence, the government did something that looked, on paper, like an act of mercy. It released him from the island, but freedom came heavily annotated. He was moved to Kimberley, placed under house arrest in a modest home in the township of Galashiu. There were no more ocean winds roaring outside his window, no more island horizon. But there were new boundaries. His every movement was controlled. He could not leave the magisterial district without permission, which almost never came. He could not attend gatherings. He could not engage in politics. His home, like his life, was fenced off by invisible lines of law. Neighbors would see him walking, quietly, sometimes with his children, sometimes alone. To them, he looked both ordinary and charged, like a live wire disguised as a man. Police cars would idle nearby, engines ticking, officers watching. If visitors came, they were noticed. Conversations were quietly monitored. Even walls had ears, and in apartheid South Africa, even doors had informants. Yet within those tight limits, he tried to turn existence back into work. He applied to practice law. Logical, given the years he had spent studying it, the sharp mind he still carried like a blade. The state blocked him. They understood what it would mean to have Robert Sobukwe standing in a courtroom, challenging laws with the same precision he had, once used in parliament halls and lecture rooms. They were prepared to let him breathe. They were not prepared to let him speak. So he worked as an attorney's clerk instead, using what space the system allowed. Clients would sometimes look twice when they realized who he was. Word spread quietly. In that small office, behind that modest desk, sits a man the government fears enough to write a special law for. He typed, he drafted, he advised, not as a public leader at a podium, but as a mind working behind legal documents, a presence that refused to vanish. The rivalry that had once been direct now took an eerie, indirect form. The ANC's leaders, still locked up on Robben Island or scattered in exile, became central to global campaigns against apartheid. Songs were written about them, posters carried their faces, international delegations asked about their conditions. Meanwhile, the architect of the March 21 campaign shuffled between his restricted home and his restricted workplace, watched, monitored. Often unseen by the outside world, the temptation to bitterness would have been immense. To know that your competitor movement now commanded the world's microphone, to hear, perhaps on a crackling radio, statements from ANC leaders or about their leaders, while your own name remained largely in shadow, but those who visited him in Kimberley recall a man who refused to drown in resentment. He stayed measured, thoughtful, focused not on personal credit, but on whether the principle at the heart of his life's work, African dignity, African agency, would survive no matter whose banner it flew under. Still, the clock did not stop. Each coughing fit was a reminder that the body has its own schedule. Each denied request to leave the district or speak publicly was a reminder that the state's fear of his voice had not faded. The time limit around him now was cruelly double-edged. His health setting one boundary, the security regulations setting another. He was racing two invisible forces at once, disease, and a government determined that he would never regain the public platform that had once made him so dangerous. In the quiet of his Kimberley nights, surrounded not by chanting crowds, but by the soft sounds of a township settling into sleep. He could measure how far he had come from those heady days of rallies and conferences. Yet the work had never really stopped. It had just changed shape, from speeches that shook halls, to laws studied in cramped rooms, to a stubborn, everyday refusal to be erased. He had already forced the apartheid state to reveal something vital about itself, that it feared ideas so deeply it would bend its own legal system to cage a single man. The question now was whether his remaining time, limited by illness, policed by the state, would be enough for him to shape, in some quiet but decisive way, the generations who would carry the struggle forward after him. How do you bury a man so completely that decades later people know the name of his rival on every continent, but stumble when you mention his? How do you turn the architect of one of apartheid's most terrifying crises into a half-forgotten footnote while building a global icon out of another prisoner held on the same island? This is the final cruelty of Robert Sobukwe's story. He helped force the regime to show the world its fangs, and then watched from the margins as history almost wrote him out. In Kimberley, time tightened around him like a noose. The state had calculated coldly. Let him out of Robben Island, but not out of our grip. His new prison was a small house in Galshew, its garden dry in the Kimberley sun, its front door a checkpoint between the man and the world. Outside, children played in the dusty street, calling to each other in bursts of laughter. Inside, on a narrow bed, or at a cluttered desk, Sobukwe wrestled with something far heavier than boredom. He was in a race now, not against a trial, not against the next police raid, but against his own failing lungs and a calendar he could see but not control. Every cough was a reminder. The body has its own deadline, and it does not negotiate. By day, he walked to the attorney's office where he worked as a clerk. There was nothing glamorous about it. No podium, no applause. Just piles of files, battered typewriters, the dry smell of paper and ink. Clients came in with eviction notices, past law violations, small and large humiliations inflicted by the system that still ruled their lives. They saw a quiet, formal man bent over documents, glasses low on his nose. Some of them recognized him. They would glance again. A double take that flashed like lightning behind their eyes. Is that him? Is that really Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, the man from 1960, the one from the newspapers, the one they said was too dangerous to free? In those cramped rooms, a strange dissonance hummed. The government's most feared agitator, a man who had once pulled thousands into the streets with a call to put down their passes and walk, now checking legal forms in a back office. Yet under the surface, the same iron pattern remained. He was still using his mind as a weapon, still learning the enemy's rules in order to find their breaking points. At night, he went home under the unblinking gaze of the security branch. Cars idled at corners. Men with notebooks watched who came and went. Phones clicked oddly when you picked them up. That faint extra silence that tells you someone else is listening. To visit his house was to accept that your name might go into a report. Your face might land in a file in some Pretoria cabinet stamped surveillance. Still, people came. Old comrades, younger activists, curious students searching for the man behind the law that bore his name. They sat on cheap chairs in a small sitting room, while his children moved quietly in the background, and his wife, Veronica, who had weathered states of emergency, isolation, and the long, slow burn of enforced waiting, poured tea. He spoke softly, deliberately, never ranting, never wasting breath. He asked questions more than he issued instructions. There was always one pressure line he refused to cross. The banning orders and house arrest that fenced his life were not just geographical. They were political gags. He was prohibited from addressing gatherings, from taking part in political organizations, from doing the very thing that had made him so dangerous, organizing people in the open. The regime dangled a twisted bargain in front of him: live, as long as you live quietly. They were betting on exhaustion, on a man ground down enough by illness and years of confinement to accept survival on their terms. He refused to accept the terms, but he adjusted the terrain. Instead of public speeches, there were one-on-one conversations. Instead of mass rallies, there were letters, readings, private debates. Young activists who visited came away struck less by firebrand rhetoric than by moral gravity. He returned, again and again, to the same core. The people themselves must be their own liberators, not patrons, not protectors, not governments bought with Western approval. The people. It sounded simple. It was dynamite, because outside his small Kimberley house, the rivalry that had once defined his political life had grown into something almost unrecognizable. The African National Congress, his old competitor, now towered in the international imagination. In London, Dar es Salaam, New York, Lusaka, posters showed a single face over and over: Nelson Mandela. The ANC's line of non-racial democracy, its careful diplomacy, its willingness to speak the language of the United Nations and Western capitals made it a natural partner for foreign governments searching for a respectable ally against apartheid. The PAC, in contrast, carried the scars of Sharpeville like a brand. It had been the spear tip of open defiance in 1960. For that, the regime had resolved not just to beat it, but to break it. Banned, decapitated of leaders, its activists hunted, its name smeared as extremist and reckless, the movement stumbled through exile and underground work, trying to keep flames alive with few resources and less safe haven. Its president, the man who had once stood before roaring crowds, who had dared to declare that Africa was for Africans, now lived under house arrest, largely invisible to the global stage. From Kimberley, Sobukwe watched this imbalance with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised. He knew exactly how the regime had played the game. They kept the Africanist who refused compromise under the heaviest lock. They let the rival current of resistance, more palatable to Western ears, breathe just enough to grow. He could see the longer game too. When this system finally cracks, whose version of freedom will step forward first? Whose language will shape the new constitution, the new myths, the new heroes? There was an easy, tempting path in front of him: bitterness. He could have stewed in it. He could have recited like a litany every time his warnings about co-option, about diluted African leadership, had been ignored. He could have let the rivalry curdle into hatred. He refused. Visitors recall him speaking of the ANC not as a mortal enemy, but as a different current in the same river. He criticized, yes, sharply, sometimes uncomfortably, but he never lost sight of the true target. The enemy, he would remind people, is not other Africans. The enemy is the system that tells us we are less than human. Still, the clock would not stop. By the early 1970s, his health had deteriorated visibly. The cough that had begun on the island became more frequent, more punishing. Some days, climbing a short flight of steps left him breathless. Requests for permission to seek better medical treatment, to travel beyond the invisible lines drawn around him, hit the same wall: refused, delayed, ignored. Time wasn't just running out. It was being stolen, day by day, behind bureaucratic phrases and stamped forms. And all around him, a new generation was waking up. On university campuses and in township schools, young black South Africans were reading things that felt like electric shocks. France, Fanon's searing analyses of colonial psychology, Malcolm X's speeches, and crucially, the early writings of leaders in the Black consciousness movement. Steve Biko, Barney Pitiana, and others were asking questions that sounded eerily familiar to anyone who had been in the rooms where Sobukwe once spoke. Who gets to define black identity? Who sets the terms of liberation? Can you truly be free if your mind still carries the colonizer's logic? In cramped dorm rooms and church halls, they quoted a man many of them had never met. This solitary figure in Kimberley, whose early speeches and writings had seeded whole paragraphs of their new language. There is only one race, the human race. The African people must be their own liberators. The continuity was unmistakable. Sobukwe became something almost mythical to them. They knew of Mandela and Sisulu on Robben Island. They saw those names in foreign newspapers. But the story of the man for whom the state had written a special law, that they learned in whispers. For them, he was proof of something terrifying and thrilling, that one person's clarity could scare a regime more than an army's guns. He was not in their meetings. He was not at their marches, but in their insistence on psychological liberation, on black pride that would not ask permission to exist. His imprint lay like a watermark. The state could hear the echo too. With black consciousness came new waves of student uprisings, new organizing in the townships, new energy that did not fit neatly into the older ANC PAC divisions. Security files thickened, detentions multiplied, and somewhere, on a list probably stamped high risk, unreliable, the names Sobukwe, Robert Mangaliso stayed marked in red. By the mid-1970s, the regime faced a decision it had long tried to postpone. His health was failing badly. Symptoms pointed to something worse than lingering TB. Doctors muttered about cancer. The man whose name they had wrapped in barbed wire for so long was visibly, irreversibly weakening. But the political danger had not gone. If they let him travel freely now, even in sickness, even just to get medical care, what conversations might he have on the road? Who might gather around him in a hospital ward, in a waiting room, at a sympathetic friend's house? In 1977, they took a step that revealed both their fear and their calculation. They allowed him, finally, to be admitted to Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town under heavy restrictions. It was not true freedom of movement. It was controlled access to treatment, wrapped in surveillance. He arrived there not as the roaring young orator of the 1950s, but as a gaunt man in his early 50s who looked 20 years older than he was. Groote Schuur was a symbol in itself, a place of cutting-edge medical research, famous internationally, performing transplants and complex operations. In its corridors, white patients walked unbothered. In one of its rooms, under watch, lay a black man, whom the state had systematically denied timely care for years because it preferred him weakened, distant, inconvenient. The diagnosis landed like a stone: advanced lung cancer. It was a bitter twist. The man who had tried to carry a continent's hope in his chest now had a disease eating that very space away. Time, once measured in sentences and banning orders, now shrank to hospital charts, painkillers, and the cold efficiency of prognosis. The countdown, this time, had a doctor's authority behind it. Friends and allies pushed desperately for him to be released fully, to allow him to spend whatever time remained in relative peace, surrounded by family, without the constant presence of men with notebooks and guns. The regime's response was, as always, half measure and half threat. They loosened some restrictions, watched others like hawks, and made it brutally clear, even in dying, he would not be allowed a platform. February 1978. In a hospital room where the curtains filtered Cape Town light into a pale, washed-out glow, Robert Sobukwe's body was losing its final argument with disease. The man who had once paced stages with electric energy now struggled to shift his weight on a thin mattress. Veronica sat with him whenever she was allowed. Old comrades came when they could, some of them carrying the unbearable knowledge that they were saying goodbye to someone the country had never properly been allowed to know. On 27th of February, his race against time ended. He was 53. No great public funeral was broadcast on state-run TV. No official day of mourning. No global outcry on the scale that would come years later for other leaders. The government's dream was simple. Let him slip away like a shadow, filed neatly into history as a former agitator who had faded into irrelevance. But history, like people, does not always do what it's told. In the townships, in exile camps, in student residences, something else happened. News of his death moved like an underground river. For those whose political awakening had been shaped by Sharpeville, by the Black consciousness movement, by the stubborn idea that Africans must own their own liberation, the loss hit with surgical precision. Because this was more than the death of a man. It was the closing of a particular chapter. The generation that had made apartheid drop its mask in 1960 was passing, one by one, before they could see the system fall. And in the rivalry that had defined so much of that generation's strategy, the harsh finality was this. The man whose approach had frightened the regime most had been kept deliberately in the shadows so long that many outside his own circles barely understood what they had lost. The ANC, forced into negotiations a decade later, would eventually inherit the reins of state. Its leaders would become presidents, ministers, ambassadors. Streets across the world would bear their names. The story that got told most loudly was of one man locked up for 27 years who emerged, reconciliatory, to lead a rainbow nation. That story matters, but it is not the only one. Parallel to it runs the quieter, harsher line of Robert Sobukwe's legacy, a line that refuses neatness. It asks different questions. What if the most dangerous thing you can say under white supremacy is not "let's negotiate," but "we will free ourselves"? What if the people taught, from kindergarten, to see themselves as inferior are told, with unbreakable calm, "You are enough. You do not need anyone's permission to be fully human. You get a law written in your name. You get a cell on an island, alone. You get a district line drawn around your life. You get denied even the small dignity of practicing the profession you studied for in stolen hours under prison lights. You get your illness recognized only when it is almost too late. And yet, you also get something the regime could never quite claw back. You become an idea. Not the kind of idea that fits comfortably on posters and in donor reports. A more unsettling one. Sobukwe's insistence on African leadership of African struggles does not sit quietly in the background of post-apartheid South Africa. It vibrates under the surface when students march under banners calling for decolonized education. It echoes when poor communities ask why economic power after 1994 still sits largely where it did before. It demands answers when, in a formerly democratic country, Black life remains cheap in the mines, on the streets, in underfunded hospitals, and in the rivalry that once seemed like a personal, immediate conflict, PAC versus ANC, Africanist versus Charterist, history has played its own twist. The ANC won the visible battle. It became the ruling party, the face of liberation in the global imagination. But the questions Sobukwe pushed into the room have not gone away. If anything, they have sharpened. His movement may have been outpaced institutionally. His name may be less famous on the world's lips, but his core demand that Africans must not just vote in a new system, but own and define it, still haunts every unresolved injustice. In the country he never got to see free. In Kuruman, where he was born, and in Galashiu, where he spent his last constrained years, there are today streets and schools that carry his name. On Robben Island, guides tell visitors about the small house where one man was kept separate from all the others, and about the clause that turned his sentence into an indefinite, renewable nightmare. Young people Many born long after his death hear the phrase Sobukwe clause and feel the chill of what it means for a state to fear a single citizen's mind more than an entire army. His story does not end with a triumphant victory march. There is no neat image of him raising a fist in a free parliament. The last act of his life is marked instead by a clock that ran out too soon, a government that never stopped trying to shrink his voice, and a rival organization that stepped into the light while he stayed, by design, in the penumbra. But sometimes, the most dangerous stories are the ones that refuse to close politely. Because now, you know this. There was a man so threatening to apartheid that it had to twist its own laws into knots to contain him. A man who chose principles over platforms, who turned even silence into a form of resistance, who spent his final years under a double deadline, one imposed by cancer, one imposed by a regime, terrified that given just a little more time, he might once again set a nation in motion. And the unfinished question he leaves us with is sharp enough to cut. In our own time, in our own countries, when power writes special rules to cage inconvenient voices, will we remember Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe as a name from a distant struggle, or as a warning that the most radical act is still to insist, clearly and without apology, that people must free themselves,